this talk, I really wanted to present you with a rather focused and condensed argument. And so I will have to read, hoping that I not bore you, but rather animate your imagination so that we can have a lively, real-time discussion afterwards. So please forgive me for reading this paper to you. So shall we start? Yeah? Yeah? Okay. So as you can see in the background, images like this regularly come up in my Facebook timeline as I scroll through the day-to-day conversations on social media here in Beirut. Visual evidences of the corrupting impact of corporate enclosures on the Mediterranean cuisine. The eruption of anger on such occasions can swell up to 50 or more comments, depending on the dish or perpetrator in question. And while under different circumstances, I would not necessarily feel tempted to further engage in the debate, I felt that in the context of this event, the intensity of resentment and frustration may provide a useful entry point to explore some of the wider material reconfigurations of the basic ingredients of collective life in the age of gene typing and biotechnology. Both no longer simply target our aesthetic sensibilities and pretensions, but the expressive qualities and source life. Encroachment on hummus as a centerpiece of local culinary traditions can be read as much more than a mere resentment of the instrumental logic of advanced capitalism, of the ways in which it conscripts difference and distinctions into a mere vehicle of market diversification, catering to cosmopolitan elites. It articulates a vehement rejection of unauthorized access to carefully crafted aesthetico-political arrangements, of the particular context and sensibilities out of which products of collective life are formed. To say this is not to fall back into reactionary discourses of cultural essentialism or fading traditions, but to pay attention to the ways in which the differential patterning of the world matters, both in the sense that it touches upon the lived and felt intensity of shared sensibilities and inclinations, but also in the sense that any intervention in the material reconfiguration of worlds, human or otherwise, inevitably transforms the wider distribution of the sensible in which life worlds are situated, and that determine who can have a share in what is common and on the time and space in which this being in common is performed. Some of you may have noticed I'm drawing on Rancière's notion of the sensible here, as a distributive regime of sensory affordances within a given structure, and that discloses the existence of something that we have in common, and the modes of participation through which voices can make themselves heard. The distribution of the sensible, in other words, carries all the familiar features of a Foucauldian apparatus. It conjoins a wide range of institutional protocols, discourses, exchange mechanisms, and regulatory maneuvers, but also distinct sets of knowledge, technologies, and aesthetic practice that set divisions between what is visible and invisible, sayable and unsayable, comprehensible or obscure. The sensible in this view is always an aesthetico-political arrangement that determines who has a part in what is common and how the terms and conditions of participation, membership, recognition are distributed and defined. And so for the purpose of my talk here, I'm particularly interested in the contribution of non-human agencies and materials in the sensory regime of gatherings and divisions, and how they implicate the culinary in its distributive activity and boundary-making acts. So the task I've set myself here is, in a rather sweeping stroke, to flesh out how the material foundation of shared sensibilities, as summarized in time-honored recipes and culinary traditions, are currently reconfigured by genetic research and bioengineering, and how that transforms our function and role as shareholders in the aesthetic political arrangements into which we are thrown. And so please don't take it as an insult. For those not from the region, here's one of the recipes for hummus. I'm sure it's not the most local or oldest one. So let me animate your imagination and tongues with this image. As you know, the hummus is one of the, contains some of the oldest and most revered crops of the Mediterranean that have defined its cuisine for more than 7,000 years. The chickpea is one of the earliest cultivated vegetables. It spread from southeastern Turkey across the entire Arab peninsula to Ethiopia and India, which, by the way, accounts for 80% of the global production today. Olive oil, another centerpiece of the Mediterranean kitchen, has been domesticated about 6,000 years ago. Unlike the chickpea, it's still one of the main exports of this region. Both are highly nutritious crops, known to thrive particularly well in sunny, dry conditions. The olive is in fact even stimulated by environmental stresses, by limited water supply or changing temperatures. The chickpea, on the other hand, appears to be a rather sensitive creature, vulnerable to insect pests, diseases, and cold temperature that led to massive crop losses and even complete failure throughout history. Such vulnerabilities are currently overcome with the purposeful development of pest-resistant crops. This happens in a close collaboration between farmers, local seed banks, and scientists who continually refine its genetic makeup through crossbreeding in the field and in the lab. The decoding of crop DNA and gene typing have made it possible to single out the most resilient types and then cross them with others to produce varieties capable of withstanding adverse circumstance. Such varieties are currently used in Sudan and Ethiopia to combat heat and desertification, the spreading of the desert, but also in Turkey and Iran to cope with frost and annual drought. This type of research, it has to be stressed, is markedly different from genetically modified food that manipulates the role and behavior of individual genes within a DNA sequence. Examples of such foods include herbicide-resistant, hyper-performing supercrops owned and patented by large biotech companies such as Monsanto and the like. The crossbreeding of farmers, by contrast, is a form of manual gene editing, if you wish, that draws on the adaptive behavior of seeds within their natural habitat. My point of highlighting this is to show that recipes as a particular set of instructions for creating shared sensory experiences never simply testify to unchanging conditions or inert values. They are an integral part of carefully crafted technocultural performances tested and refined over centuries. Such performances link multiple ways of seeing, knowing, and acting in the world into an ongoing process of transversal exchange, in which humans and non-human substances, energies, designs, and materials, each imbued with their own inherent awareness and mode of speaking and being, all play their part. Genes adjust their expressive behaviors in response to changing climate conditions, which then in turn inspires new interventions by farmers who are themselves struggling to survive in the face of fluctuating market prices and uncertain environmental and economic conditions. The recipe may sit at the very end of these recursive inclinations, but as such, it implicitly testifies to the many risks, to the failures and productive accidents that are involved in the invention of formulas, that aim to strike a perfect balance. A balance between distinct needs and characteristics of parts, but also a balance between sensory and aesthetic experience and the pragmatics of day-to-day sustenance. Recipes in this sense function like a program, as a set of instructions inferred from technocultural performances that open up alternative principles of social organization, structured around sensory marks. Membership, voice, recognition, all of them are no longer confined by the policed space of institutionalized relations to the language of rights and entitlements and their differential distribution between individuals and populations. It delimitates the space of the common as lived and embodied practice, where different kinds of commitment and obligation, indeed a shared sense of appreciation, are demanded and forged. Obligations, as Povinelli writes, constitute a peculiar no man's land, somewhere between choice and determination. Being obliged to something doesn't mean being determined by it. It's a much richer form of relationality, a continuous nurturing or caring for, bindings that are often initially very delicate spaces of connectivity and prehension. Choices are then made to enrich and intensify these connections, in which those involved are themselves transformed. And so it's in this sense that I consider the recipe as part of much wider aesthetico-political arrangements in which fragile lines of connectivity are consolidated into a distributive regime of shared sensibilities, needs, and apprehensions across species and between living and non-living forms. They invest entities with a shared set of references to experience what they hold in common, irrespective of their status or position within preconceived spatio-temporal registers or classificatory regimes. Yet this commonality is never absolute or an a priori given. It's the result of the lively relationality of our entanglement with other microsubjectivities, each of which is able to articulate itself in its own time and manner of speaking. This cacophony of voices diffracts the terms and conditions of membership and participation deep into the material fabric of perception and experience itself. Our ability to prehend all these different manners of self-expression has up until recently been confined to observable behaviors, to the performance of crops out in the field as they defend themselves against microbial or climatological attacks. It's only with the decoding of our common gene pool in the early 70s that this underlying source code of biological defense mechanisms and adaptive behaviors disclosed itself as integral part of our common existence and expressive repertoires. We know now that only a fraction of genes is in an active state, turned on and ready to speak, while others remain silent, and that these silences nonetheless influence how a given organism articulates to the wider system of which it is part. This gradual decoding of genetic repertoires that humans and non-humans share introduced a whole new set of facts to how we recognize and experience our being in common. It afforded new means of facilitating abilities to speak and to participate in world-making events. But by the same term, it also afforded new means of policing and distributing the roles and responsibilities, and indeed the commitments and obligations that this being in common entails. If politics, as Rancière suggests, revolves around who has the ability to see and the talent to speak, and around the properties of spaces and the possibilities of time involved, then it appears little surprising that the differential patterning of speech across germplasms and DNA sequence has become one of the most contentious sites of struggle. The struggle over the terms and conditions on which the elemental foundation of our existence is negotiated and considered in regards to the protection, distribution, and indeed the sharing of earthly resources and materials. Now, my point here is not to reiterate well-rehearsed critiques of bio-inequality, nor am I arguing for a new form of genetic constitutionalism or microbial citizenship as demanded by some. I'm rather interested in the ways in which our access is to manipulate and even completely replace entire biological organisms with synthetically manufactured ones. And here I want to give you a few examples to show you how far we have gone. Everyone, I'm sure, is aware of the fact that honeybees are on the brink of extinction or rapidly dying out, right? And so this is one experiment. I think it was conducted in Germany, or it's celebrated as one of the large successes to genetically, to experiment with gene-edited honeybees in the lab and get them to produce more, and in particular more males, genetically replicating reproductive behavior so as to save the species as such. So this is just one such example how this capture of the source code of life animates technocultural imaginations that rather than tackling the source of the extinction of the species itself, simply redirect all their efforts to just replicating and working towards a synthetic replacement that makes the problem altogether disappear. And we can see this kind of way of thinking fired up by gene code and big data analytics that are currently dominating the field in all areas of daily life. This is meat manufactured, again, synthetically in the lab. It was developed by the Maastricht University in 2013. This is how it looks as a starter, so to speak. And guess who bought the first portion of this meat conserved into a dish, in this case a burger? Any guesses? Well, it was one of the Google founders, Sergey Brin, and he even paid $300,000 for it. For someone who's completely obsessed and does nothing more than think about data and its politics, this comes a little surprisingly. Why would Google be interested in synthetic meat and geo-manufactured foods? It's a huge source of profits. Just imagine the amount of data that Google is able to collect about yourself. Every single day, you share your most intimate desires and secrets with it as you use your search engine to find whatever it is you might be looking for or feel inspired by. Linking this kind of data to the quality of producing synthetic foods is the perfect match to open up an entire new market that replaces anything that we have known so far in terms of organic food production, and to create tastes up on the subconscious kind of traces of yourself you leave behind on the search engine, to introduce products to you that you could have never imagined that you ever wanted, and sell it to you at whatever price is deemed to be fit. And to show you that it doesn't stop there, you now find entire companies who call themselves bioworks, offering biology by design. So what they are doing is basically they are extracting, here's one example, existing gene sequences to again synthetically reproduce, extracting enzymes and other types of codes to reproduce what you find in nature, but again synthetically or simply from other source material that would not necessarily have produced it in its natural habitat. Here, rose oil from yeast. And so, compared to these kind of fast-forward loops into a synthetic future, the interference in the hummus recipe may seem a comparatively minor and negligible infringement. And yet my point here is that both follow the same logic as genetically engineered and even manufactured organisms or substances that I've just shown you. Both of them recalibrate the particular in the image of abstract universals, the universal currency of money or genetic code. This abstraction into computable values adds a whole new layer of materiality to lived and embodied substance that allows for the infinite recalibration and redirection of their expressed purpose for all sorts of aspirations and ends. Along with it goes a radical transformation of knowledge ontologies and who is in a position to define them, that we are only just beginning to understand. Genetic exchange, as Adam Nojek writes, is no longer subject to the vertical transmission of information-based Mendelssohn's paradigm. It's subject to a more flexible mode of transversal exchanges in which new ontologies of association and new microbial recombinations can be formed. This is a model of being and becoming that defies species boundaries and sexual compatibility. And while this may not be an altogether new paradigm for biological knowledge, what is clear is that when such destandardizations of life forms and matter become the norm, biological materials no longer have a self-evident function. They may be recombined and repurposed for the design of effective biological systems that become increasingly indistinguishable from the abstraction of capital in data-based or commodity form. Both reduce biological life to interchangeable parts within preconceived exchange circuits, whose function and role is divorced from any specific context or obligation to its underlying object or source. My point here is not to call for the return to innocent beginnings, the naive realism of organic movements, slow food, and the like, but to ask how this abstraction of our entangled existence into patterns of visibility, calculability, and ultimately efficiency and prediction affects our claims and the stakes in the potentiality of matters of life. How it affects our ability to participate and contest the material reconfigurations involved in this intervention, refinement, and substitution of living and non-living forms. This is to say, data has become our second nature, our second skin, if you wish. But the kind of relationship in which we exist in and through it remains undetermined and unclear. If this is left to those who control the technologies and concepts needed to design this relationship, we lose some of the core foundations and preconditions to have a say in and affect how we are in common. What we lose are the unpredictabilities, the uncertainties that enable collective life-making, the particular modes of collaboration and interaction that shared risks enable, and that distribute possible responses across human and non-human domains. Agency, as Karen Barat writes, is the possibility for a mutual response to power imbalances and worldly configurations. And yet, where should we locate this agentive potential if the primary substance of worldly reconfigurations is no longer our lived and embodied existence, but its abstraction in data that increasingly takes on commodity form? The point I'm trying to make here is that the question is no longer who is the subject of rights, but what is the substance around which rights, ethical commitments, and obligations are established? And how do we ensure open and common access to this new layer of data-based materialities, our second skin or nature, so that we can reclaim our stakes in defining how we want to be in common, free from the divisive and fragmenting incursions of logics of extraction, enclosure, and accumulation that are no longer bound to the frames of reference from which they were drawn. And so I leave it here, hoping to not have overstretched your attention and imagination, and look forward to receive your questions.
Hello. Hello. Hi. Hi. I know you just talked about it, but could you clear your position on the genetically modified? Because you said something like, "This is not what I am standing for." But could you repeat your position?
Where I stand on this issue?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's just naive to kind of. There's no option to simply refuse it. It's there to stay. It's a constitutive part of our reality. And I'm not necessarily a techno-optimist, but I do think that technologies and abilities to generate new forms of knowledge are there to serve societies and improve our condition of being in common, and here not necessarily from the privilege, from the usual position of privileging the human, but precisely to the contrary. We are afforded with sensory possibilities at the moment that allow us to see things that we have never been able to see before, to understand organisms that always appeared on the experiential surface of the world rather alien or different or other or incomprehensible. We are able to see and understand and develop a shared understanding with these other modes of existence, that these potentials cannot be left in the hands of private corporations who, by and large, unregulated, simply by the dictate of markets, take the decision for what kind of aesthetic, political, and cultural technical arrangements these new possibilities are used. And so I think the more technology advances and the more of our existence is available in datafied form, the very basic terms and conditions of our being and being with is up for a complete renegotiation, because data is infinitely recombinable up to the point where we become substitutable. And so this is what I mean when I say the place and stakes of politics is in our relationship with this data. And it's one of the most difficult and yet precious relationships to negotiate, because it requires a lot of skills, a different set of knowledge that we never associated with the field of politics and the political. And yet it becomes of utmost importance. Coding becomes a life skill, if you wish, and an essential political strategy to kind of articulate, if possible, some form, if not resistance, then disruption, objection, and contention to this new regime of sensory enclosures that is currently unfolding around us. Is that clear? If I'm speaking in too abstract language, then please don't hesitate to say, strip it down. I'm happy to make myself more explicit.
Thank you, Marika, for this stimulating presentation. I was surprised that you ended on the subject of rights, or the subject who has rights, because I would assume that you've kind of moved us outside of the subject as a narrative that involves ethics, that involves intersubjectivity, that involves community in a particular way, and how food here is, or the recoding of food operates in this context. So you're still holding on to the subject?
No, completely not. It's precisely to say the question is no longer who's the subject of right, which was always the wrong question in the first place. It's what is the substance around which rights, claims, ethical commitments, and obligations are established. That is the place and stakes of politics. It's probably I didn't make that clear. It's precisely to do away with this representational thinking that always needs a bounded body on which it can project these kind of imagined political possibilities. No, the political is doing its material substance, and increasingly a datafied substance, which relates to what I just said before, and why we have immersed ourselves in this new materiality.
But if I may elaborate, where do ethics come from then? If we are moving outside of a particular narrative of subjectivity, where do ethics come from? Given your framework, the Ranserian framework.
In my engagement and ultimately rejection of the Ranserian framework, ethics comes from giving up these divisions between ethical substance and the material substances that surround us. They are simply one. They are indistinguishable. To insist on this inherent inseparability between ethics and what we tended to think of as subject, object, entities, elements, material, there's only, to speak in the language of Islam, there's only one substance. And it's the foundation of all ethics that are there to come. Now, the tricky question is, how do we, and I think that's the challenge, how do we square data into this ethical thinking as a new layer of materiality in which we are always exist in multiple versions of ourselves, again, not a new phenomenon, but where these multiplicities that have always defined us take on this new material form. And if you look at the ways in which this new materiality is policed and regulated, it's again regulated in a way treating it as an object. It's just data. Of course we respect privacy, but this data exhaust that you leave behind, this is just noise. So why would we not kind of generate and use it for some surplus value we can generate to the benefit of society? So the practice of data-driven businesses, and the laws that regulate it uphold this distinction between the subject and its data, and therefore allow for these divisions of ethical commitments and obligations, and make sure they are kept in separate places for good reasons. Because leaving your data as a new form of material expression of your objective existence in the world, in the realm of market regulation, as a mere object and resource to be exploited. We know the story of what happens when we treat whatever exists around us as mere resource ready to be exploited, and the subject over there, which is kept in the field of rights, and because they no longer match together. The language of rights is incapable of addressing these radical enclosures on the very fabric of our existence in the world.
Hello. At some point you mentioned that data has become our second nature, our second skin, if you will. And I'd wanted to ask if you could speak a little more about the idea of data and optimization, right? And if we are doomed, if data is our second nature, are we doomed into a future in which we always have to optimize, or not optimize, but like deal with data in some form of fashion?
Yeah, that's precisely the political challenge. How to reclaim a space of uncertainty, not out of a naive kind of, it has become very fashionable to kind of, in a rather intricate move, to claim these rights of obscurity, and in a very kind of rather strange move of taking post-colonial discourses into the field of data, and insist on this right of obscurity, of always being multiple versions at one. I don't believe in this, but certainly what we need, if data is kind of always the secondary layer that makes us available to forces far beyond our control and without our awareness, some new mechanisms of your visibility, accessibility, and to others becomes manageable for you, not necessarily as a conscious decision, but where some dimensions of yourself are simply not available to these kind of claims from, let's say, corporations, government, security agencies. So that you can make a choice yourself about the degree and intensity to which you are accessible and readable and predictable and calculable by others. Now, the problem is that this has been traditionally negotiated under the label of privacy, right? It's fundamentally counterproductive, because not only does privacy, again, require this kind of bounded, singular, self-enclosed subject that we would hope to finally do away with, it ignores the entanglement and interconnectivity and the processual quality of subjectivity, for one. And it also ignores the expanded boundaries of the body that our datafied selves, that define our datafied selves. We no longer exist here where domains of where we are public and where we are private can be strictly kept apart. I'm sitting here now in a public space, yes, yet you are not my only audience. I'm not sure if this is streamed, but possibly or potentially my presence can be replicated into many, many other spaces and many, many other contexts without where my presence takes on a life of its own. And so this distributed form of existence, the challenge here is not so much how to maintain visibility, but how to kind of come in a position to control the distribution of your presence and the expansiveness of your boundaries, facilitated by data. And that is precisely this biggest challenge. And that's why it's precisely why I'm saying rights to privacy don't help us, because the law always needs kind of certainty and boundaries to determine where, when, and to whom it applies, right? It's a fundamentally ontological problem. It's what kind of an ontological status we assign data in our social organization and political organization where this question needs to be solved. And that brings me back to this question of the indivisibility of substance. There can, once we stop thinking about data and ethics as an issue to be negotiated separately, we may come one step further in acknowledging this new material foundation of our distributed existence. That's as best as I can explain it now. Clear?
Are there any more questions? Okay. Thank you, Monica. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.